Thank you for attending. I'd also like to thank the Asan Institute, MJ Chung, and Drs. Ham and Lee for inviting me and allowing me to put together this panel for the discussion today. Energy and oil in the Middle East, it's a very timely topic given all of the press and all of the pressure being put on Iran over its nuclear program, the sanctions coming out of the U.S., internationalizing those sanctions. Instability in the Middle East is a big issue too. Call it the Arab Spring, whatever you like, but it's also instability, and it impacts the price of oil. And the Fukushima disaster as well has a major impact both in China and beyond, given its impact on the nuclear industry and how that's going to affect oil supplies. So that's just a couple of the things out there making this the timely issue it is. I think we've got just the panel to do the topic justice, but doing the topic justice is going to take a while, so I'm going to get through the introductions very quickly here. I don't want to go into a lot of detail on bios. You've got those in your books. We're going to start out with Nobuo Tanaka, who's Global Associate for Energy Security and Sustainability at the Institute for Energy Economics, Japan. Tanaka-san is an ideal candidate to talk about these issues, having just served as the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency and having spent a long career at METI covering these issues and many others. Tony Cordesman is Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. Tony is a leading voice on Middle East security political issues. He's written quite extensively on the topic for many, many years. He's had several stints in government, DOD, DOE. He worked at NATO. He was National Security Advisor to Senator John McCain. He, in that regard, he's a former colleague of mine in Senator McCain's office. And then Mike Herberg. Mike is Research Director in Energy Security, Research Director of the Energy Security Program at NBR, National Bureau of Asian Research. He spent a long career, a 20-year career at ARCO, doing political risk in one form or another for ARCO, and is really a go-to person for issues associated with risk in East Asia, particularly. In fact, I think Mike was the first person that came to mind when I thought about who we could pull together for this discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanaka-san. He can get us started, and we'll just go down the line and then open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you. As I was working for this organization, International Energy Agency in Paris, yes, as you know that this is an energy security forum using strategic stockpile in case of real disruption. We used 3 times in the history. Once in the Gulf War, second in the Hurricane Katrina, and third in the last year in this Libyan crisis. My concern at this moment is Iranian crisis really happens? If it happens, it's 17 million barrels per day of the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz and natural gas tankers. So, and Japan situation is really now serious. No nuclear powers running. I mean, just one now. No nuclear powers running if Iranian crisis happens, and these fuels may not come. It's a disaster. It's more than disaster. So I'm really cautioning Japanese government. They should prepare for the situation. And this kind of situation may happen much more frequent than once in 1,000 years, like tsunami. So the government should have learned something last year, and we will see. But I'm just fingers crossed. But many people, I talk with people in Washington, in Europe, everywhere, and there's a good chance that Israel attacks Iran this year or even earlier, before summer. So just that is the short-term real concern of this oil situation. A little longer term, yes, the Arab Spring is always, discouraging investment into the new capacity or exploration development in the region. So IEA had said in the last World Energy Outlook, so-called deferred investment scenario, and about 30% lower investment in this region means that, that there are, let's say, about 3 or 4 million barrels per day short of production, and then it means the price of oil will rise up to $150 per barrel. That's a mid-term, let's say, kind of crisis scenario. And this is another concern, too. Now, in the longer term, yes, this is more the Asian issue, because Asian economic growth certainly increased the importation of oil, and China is now the largest consumer of energy, but eventually largest importer of oil, largest consumer of oil, in toward 2030. And then energy crisis is Asian issue. So IEA has long been trying to get China, India into the organization, but never succeeded. So if IEA is going to use the strategic stockpile in the future, the very close collaboration with these big consumers are really necessary, so that reframing the organizational energy security framework could be very, very important in the future. And the gas is another issue. The gas, maybe golden age of gas is coming, what IEA has said, but if China is using just as much as, let's say, gas they have and importing, and this is another big, let's say, tight market in gas may happen. Russia may play an important role. But in that final point I want to make here is that the future energy security is a more electricity supply, because electrification happening using not only oil but gas, coal, nuclear, renewables. So how you supply electricity in a stable manner to the consumer is the future energy security. And European concept is connecting the country market by grid lines, interconnection. Can this kind of thing happens in East Asia? And this is a very interesting question. I am proposing more after this tsunami and disaster that Japanese market should be connected to our neighbors, Korea or Russia, or both. And if Japan cannot really build nuclear power plant in Japan, why not in Russia? Why not in Korea? Why not in China? Why not in Mongolia? But if the connection is connected, interconnection is done. So this is difficult, of course, but this kind of regional concept of energy security framework is getting very important for the future stability of the Asian economic growth. That's my comment.
Can I just ask you a quick question before we move on? The last point you made, Japan seems already be taking some criticism for shutting down its nuclear power plants at the same time it's energetically selling them abroad. That seems to be some version of the same thing. If you build them in Russia or you build them in Korea and connect them by a grid, you're essentially doing the same thing. We're scared to have them here, but we'd like to build them in your country and ship them in. Do you still face that kind of criticism?
Yeah, I think that is a very relevant criticism. So definitely Japan should maintain the nuclear power in Japan. I mean, but to expand or replacing the old ones, it's an option. Just like Singapore is investigating the technology of nuclear, because they are not interested in building one in Singapore, but investing in your neighbors. So if there is a willingness of building nuclear power, I mean, it's not necessarily nuclear power, but Russia is full of hydropower, full of gas, full of coal. So if we connect through Korea, North Korea, it is a very interesting concept. Pan-Japan Sea connection is a very interesting security arrangement if politically agreeable. That's, let's say, a caveat, but why not in the future?
Tony?
Let me just begin by saying it's easy to focus only on Iran, but I think it's important to put the Gulf and, in fact, Middle East energy in context. We do have, and we just had a very good panel on the Arab Spring, but this is a region which in general has massive population problems. It has problems with water, it has problems with governance, it has problems with infrastructure, it has massive problems with job creation. And looking at a report which came out last year from the Arab Development Report, it's very important to put some of these things in context, because when we talk about Iraq, for example, here is a country which ranks roughly 159th in the world in per capita income, which is not that far from Kuwait, which ranks 12th, or that far from Qatar, which ranks third or first, depending on the ranking. You talk about Saudi Arabia, and people naturally think of this as a wealthy oil state. It actually has about 54th in per capita income, which puts it in the lower rank of middle-income states in per capita income. If you look at Iran, depending on the source, it's 78th to 84th in per capita income, which really simply represents 30 years of massive economic mismanagement. The population pressure problem is declining in birth rate, but it goes on through 2040. So this is an inherently unstable region with some of the worst problems in governance and job creation in any part of the world. And again, I would just encourage you to look at the UN reporting or any of the other reporting on the economic side. It isn't just politics. It isn't just military security. But very briefly, if you look through the Gulf in terms of military security, Yemen as an energy producer doesn't matter. It's too small to solve its own economic problems, and it's largely irrelevant in world markets. There are oil companies to which it's important, but strategically into the world, that's not relevant. What is critical is, in every possible dimension, it is a failed state in terms of population pressure, economy, and resources. It has massive population pressure. It is right next to Saudi Arabia. It is right next to Oman. It has building up within it, divisions within its military, its security structure. It's become the center of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And in spite of efforts to counter that, the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is growing. What's going to happen with Yemen in terms of its impact on the region is extremely questionable. And I would say it's probably the only state I know of in the Arab world which has managed to get to the point where the World Bank can't even find a convincing path of hope for development in the country. Water, population, resources, drugs, all of them. We think of Kuwait as relatively stable. I think it's important to realize that stability is true to some extent, but it is declining. There is a growing set of sectarian tensions. And what is important from the energy side is it has one of the most inefficient oil companies in the Gulf, and it is not in a position to carry forward a solid energy development program. There's a very good study that's been done by the Energy Information Agency, and it's very important to remember that the quality of a company and the willingness to actually develop is critical. Bahrain, frankly, is critical largely because, in energy terms, of its impact on the stability of the Gulf. Iran, it's a U.S. base, and it is to some extent a shield for Saudi tensions with their own Shiites. UAE has a rather bad mix of oil companies, but is not a security problem. Oman is right across the strait from Iran. It faces a significant security problem at the Straits. But here, let me begin with a critical point. I hear people talking constantly about closing the Straits. That is not what Iran practices in military terms. It is only one possible scenario of a much broader set of Iranian military choices. And when Iran does practice around the strait, it rarely focuses only on the Strait of Hormuz. It focuses on the tanker channels within the Gulf that extend along an island net that is 100 kilometers beyond the strait, and it increasingly deploys in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. So let me just say, if you read anything that focuses on closing the strait, throw it away and go on and read somebody who has at least some practical knowledge of what's happening in the region. And certainly the Omanis realize this, and they realize the complexity of it. Qatar is a very efficient state. It's also tied to a common gas field with Iran. It is the largest single air base the U.S. has in the region. It has certainly put an immense amount of its political capital into providing that basing capability. And that means in any confrontation in the Gulf, Qatar would be immediately seen as by Iran, as a U.S. center, and potentially that might lead Iran to act out. When we talk about Saudi Arabia, I think in the near term at least, the risks are minimal. Whether it can actually get to 14 million barrels a day and sustain it, whether that really will maintain what people think of as surplus capacity, none of us know, and at this point in time, we probably have plenty of years to find out. What is critical is that Saudi Arabia's ties to the United States over the last 2 years have become far closer than they were in the past. On a military level, the actual level of planning and cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia now resembles, at the level of the regime at least, something far closer to what happened during the first Gulf War and the liberation of Kuwait than the problems that existed between the United States and Saudi Arabia over military issues in the past. The U.S. is seeking to create Saudi forces that are directly interoperable with the U.S., and at the same time which gives Saudi Arabia decisive capabilities in the Yemeni border area, in dealing with the Iranian Air Force, and operating over the Gulf. And this includes a level of maritime surveillance and intelligence assets which are far more advanced than what Saudi Arabia's had. It's not new aircraft as much as new equipment for it. The gap that Saudi Arabia has, the gap that all of the Gulf states have, is it has a navy. It is not a particularly bad navy. It is not a particularly good navy. But it is a regular navy. It is not a navy with anti-submarine capability. It is not a navy with meaningful anti-mine capability. Saudi Arabia does have the only minesweepers in the Gulf, but the fact is that minesweepers, even when they're operated by Britain and the United States, run into the problems. In 1991, when we went to war with Iraq, the most advanced minesweepers in the world were British. They moved into Iraqi waters and did not detect a minefield until the U.S. was actually in it. Fortunately, the minefield was not particularly well structured, but the model is a warning. And remember where that was. It wasn't at the Strait. It wasn't in some predictable point in the Gulf. And you can mine anywhere in the Gulf, at any port, at any facility in the Gulf. Any dhow, any small ship can drop mines. So low-level conflicts become immediately an issue. So does sabotage. So do raids on offshore facilities. Iran regularly practices what is supposedly the defense of offshore facilities. For those of you who aren't military analysts, if you want to be aggressive in your military exercises, you always claim you're being defensive. But the fact is that that is something Iran has carried out now for something like 5 years of steady buildups. And these are not something you can easily find in what they say. They're very clear in what they do. Iraq is caught between Syria, the United States, Iran, and its own internal divisions. It's not always obvious to people outside the military. But Iraq's average level of violence is marginally lower than that in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is supposedly at war, but it's a very small enemy. Iraq is supposedly at peace, but it has a great many internal divisions. And when it comes down to these incidents of violence, it is very serious. It is also at this point, barely functioning as a government structure. Its security forces are in decline. They are highly politicized, tied to the leader. There are serious problems with ordinary security, just day-to-day operational security. It's a government paralyzed in terms of investment, tax, and energy reform. And whether it can hold together is more and more questionable. The head of the Kurdish region, the president of the Kurdish region, has talked about having a referendum. He's talked about independence. He's condemned the prime minister. The divisions between Sunni and Shiite in the Arab side have been growing steadily. How serious this will be is not predictable. But if you are Iraq, also remember that at this point in time, they have virtually no meaningful military capability if Iran should put pressure on them. And the only way the United States can put pressure on them at this point is from Kuwait. So you have basically a very important power vacuum, and it's one that won't be corrected for at least 4 to 5 more years. And that finally brings us to Iran, and let me just close with a couple of points. Iran does not focus on conventional warfare. One of the reasons Iran seeks missile and nuclear capabilities, its air force is obsolete and partly operational. Most of its surface-to-air missiles date back to the time of the Vietnam War and basically are extremely vulnerable to countermeasures. It does not have ground forces that can easily project any real depth. It is not a country equipped with a modern navy. It has put more modern weapons on ships, which again date back to the time of the Shah. What it has done is build up an immense force of smaller ships, about 20,000 naval guards, very large mine forces. It has 3 submarines that can lay smart mines with long-range wire-guided torpedoes. It has something like 20 to 30 areas it can operate in along the Gulf, ranging from Iraq to the area outside the Straits. And it has regularly practiced using these. And its mix of assets include things like smart mines. These are mines you could put into any port that would activate at a given interval. They can detect the size of a given ship and attack a ship according to its tonnage, its noise profile. And as a result, it becomes the kind of system that you can use almost without warning. 1987 to 88, it used free-floating mines as a weapon regularly to deal with the Gulf tanker channels. It's occupying at this point 7 islands in the tanker channels on the other side of the strait. And it just had a confrontation yet again with the UAE, in which basically it has now seized full control, if you can have fuller control, I guess is the better term, over the islands that it took from Sharjah at the time of the Shah. It's carried out very large exercises. It can combine mobile, ground-based anti-ship missiles, Chinese-supplied, fairly good Chinese-supplied, small anti-ship missiles, and all of these assets can be used with considerable flexibility. There is no question that they cannot win any kind of meaningful war this way. And if they did close the strait, they do shut off their own exports. They are in many ways now considerably more vulnerable than the other Gulf states, simply in terms of capital and resources. But if they want to create a tanker premium, to constantly harass, to create attacks too small to have a general war over, they can do that, and they practice this, and they practice it very explicitly as part of their naval exercises. So you were really talking about, first, a very wide range of Iranian scenarios that could be deliberate. And then there is the question, if we have a clash, what kind of accidents can you have? And then the range there becomes almost open-ended. And they have, in naval exercises, on several occasions used their ballistic missile and rocket force as a nominal use of defending themselves. They've never done this operationally. One has to be very careful about the open press about these missiles because, quite frankly, they probably are far less capable than most press reporting would indicate. But this is perhaps the most open risk. The only other thing I would say is, as long as this goes on, there are two other things to remember. You're talking about 20% of the world's conventional oil assets. We, at least in the U.S., estimate Iraq will be very lucky to get half of Iraq's goal of 12 million barrels a day. The U.S. estimate is, as long as Iran is caught up in sanctions and with today's political problems, it cannot expand or really even maintain over time its oil and gas production. And this affects global supply, even if there's no military conflict at all.
You know, Walter, I'm going to hold it against you for making me follow Tony Cordesman. It's an unenviable thing to do to follow Tony. He's so extraordinarily articulate and thorough. Let me first thank the Asan Institute for inviting me and bringing me here to speak to such a distinguished group, and I've learned a lot from the sessions, as well as Walter and the Heritage Foundation. Let me try to put some broader perspective from an Asian oil dependence, energy security perspective to the crisis. The current crisis is the most recent of about 8 major supply shocks, supply crises, wars, other events in the Gulf that I've watched since 1979, the Iran Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, minor things in between, and now the Iran crisis. This is a nasty neighborhood that Tony has sketched out very nicely. Unfortunately for Asia, it's going to be deeply dependent on this region for its oil supplies, for a huge proportion of its oil supplies. It's already in that situation, and in fact, that's going to become more pronounced in the future. So I think this current crisis just brings into very sharp relief Asia's energy security dilemma, that its dependence on Gulf oil is already huge, and it's going to get, unfortunately for Asia, much, much bigger in the future. I don't want to throw out a lot of numbers here, but Asia consumes about 25, 26 million barrels of oil a day total. This is South Asia all the way through Korea. 17 of which roughly is imported. So they're already at 75% regional import dependence from outside the region. 3/4 of that oil imports comes from the Persian Gulf. If you look forward, demand is probably going to rise in Asia, oil demand, by another 12 million barrels a day over the next 20 years. Virtually 90% of that oil will have to come from the Persian Gulf, that incremental growth. And why is that? Well, that's because that's where 2/3 of the world's oil supplies are, and that's going to be the source of a large majority of the incremental crude that the global market needs for the future. Asia will essentially account for 75 or 80% of the entire incremental increase in global oil demand over the next 20 years or so. These are things that Tanaka-san worked on at the IEA. So Asia is the center of oil demand today and for the future, and the Gulf is the center of supply, incremental supply, for the future. Russia can provide some supplies, Central Asia, Latin America, Africa, but that's really lunch money compared to the scale of incremental imports, oil imports that Asia is going to need. 6 million barrels a day, probably just incremental demand from China. China now is accounting for nearly half of the annual increase in global oil demand, just China all by itself. That's how large Asia and China have become. So this Middle East, Gulf, Asia, oil and LNG, liquefied natural gas, connection is enormous and going to continue to grow. And so there's a lot of things happening. One is a real acceleration of nexus of ties and relationships, business and trade, and increasingly diplomatic, political relationships between the Asian powers and the Gulf. And hardly a week goes by there's not a delegation from one of the major Asian countries in the Gulf or a delegation from the Gulf out in China or somewhere in Asia. Because for the Gulf, 75% of its oil exports today go to Asia. 90% of its future incremental exports of oil, as it grows, will go to Asia. So this is a match made in hell, if you're thinking in terms of energy security. So the ties are growing, this nexus between Asia and the Middle East. At the same time, the Asian states are all trying to diversify away from dependence on Gulf oil as a deliberate, explicit policy. And I remember I was in a meeting at the East-West Center, and each of the representatives from each country in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, India got up and said, we are diversifying away from our dependence on Gulf oil in the future. Well, when 75% of the incremental supplies in the future will have to come from the Gulf, it's simply mathematically impossible for everybody to reduce their exposure to the Gulf at the same time. But the countries in the region are making every effort to develop supplies elsewhere outside the region. And just elaborate on one other set of issues, and then I'll let it open for discussion. But I think the current Iran crisis and the fears of a disruption, and there's any number of scenarios for that kind of a problem that Tony sketched out some of that. It's aggravating an existing underlying broader problem in Asia's oil and energy security picture. And that is the increasing intensity of a mercantilist, zero-sum national competition to control oil supplies and oil supply routes wherever possible. It's a zero-sum atmosphere, deeply mercantilist approach where countries are each trying to get control of their own national future supplies of oil, each one anxious that in the future they won't have access to those oil supplies because the other states are out going and locking up, quote unquote, those supplies. Now that concept in fact doesn't really work, but that's the atmospheric, that's the perception amongst much of the leadership in Asia, amongst the big oil importers. And you can see this in countries sponsoring their national oil companies with energy diplomacy, cheap loans, all kinds of related benefits that are being put into these deals to put their national oil company ahead of the other country in Asia's national oil company to get the next deal for the next big oil project in Central Asia or the Gulf or Africa or wherever else it is. Competition over controlling pipeline routes and which direction each pipeline goes from Eurasia and Russia to Asia. I could go through several cases of that. Competition over controlling small gas fields offshore China and Japan in a shoving match over a gas field that the commercial companies walked away from 10 years ago. It's so small, but which has become a cause of real friction between Japan and China. So there's this atmospherics of competition to control these supplies, and that's extended to controlling supply routes. And this is animating and amplifying all the difficulties we have in the South China Sea over sea lane control, U.S. control of those sea lanes, maritime claims for potentially rich oil and gas areas in the South China Sea. So it's aggravating those issues because the countries in the region see those as potentially nearby secure oil supplies. And this is going through the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits, and in the long run, the Indian Ocean will become an arena of this kind of competition for control of the sea lanes. And believe me, that's coming. 80% of the entire increase in global oil trade, 80% plus, over the next 20 years, will be moving through the Indian Ocean. This is going to be a very crowded place in the next 20 years. And it's wide open for strategic competition. You can only imagine China, as China extends its maritime capabilities, as India becomes nervous, Australia, I've spent a lot of time out there on these issues lately. So without laboring too far on this, I think the current crisis simply aggravates that fear, the anxieties, and this kind of cycle of each country looking to get control of its supplies, beggar thy neighbor form of oil competition. And this is the energy competition and suspicion is spilling over into the strategic arena, aggravating strategic distrust and rivalries in the region. And the strategic rivalries in the regions bleed back over into the energy competition, perception that we are competing. And, Japan, China, important strategic rivalry, whatever you want to call that in the region, it's being aggravated by these energy tensions, and vice versa. The strategic distrust makes it more difficult to cooperate on regional energy cooperations, the kinds of things that Tanaka-san was talking about. Regional cooperation over these supply development, pipeline infrastructure. There's been a lot of proposals and there are nominal efforts, but cooperation's been very short supply. So I think this crisis simply is another, streetcar coming by, which I think epitomizes what Asia is going to have to live with for the foreseeable future in terms of its oil security, energy security, and the need for Asia to begin to talk to one another and work together to collectively, collaboratively address what's a common problem, that unstable, pathologically unstable global oil market. So with that, Walter,
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask you very quickly, you talked about diversifying sources of oil looking forward. Is there any prospect of diversifying away from oil in the region, particularly shale gas, natural gas? Is there any prospect of that changing some of the numbers that you just referenced?
Well, the underlying problem is that oil is the perfect transportation fuel. You just can't beat it in terms of volume, weight, and energy value. I mean, it's a very simple physics. So natural gas supplies look very abundant with U.S. shale supplies and potential other shale supplies. But making natural gas a transportation fuel at scale, the technology and the cost structure right now is pretty marginal. And you have infrastructure of how you supply gas to a transportation fleet, things like that. So even though you have very positive picture on supplying gas, natural gas, it's hard to see when that will translate to dealing with your oil challenge, which is transportation. That's really what oil's about in today's world. So you have to come up with a transportation technology and there's lots of things happening, and of course hybrids and things like that, but scaling that up over the next 20 years is going to be a task, let alone in the next 5 and 10 years.
Thank you. Well, let me open it up to questions. I've got plenty if no one has any. Yeah, okay.
Thanks. My name is Ian Begg from the London School of Economics. All the panelists have concentrated on supply. Now, as an economist, I'm trained. There's another side to the equation, namely demand. US demand for carbon-related fuels is roughly 4 times that of China, double that of Europe, suggesting there is a considerable latitude for altering the supply-demand balance. So to what extent do the panelists see scope in demand change as opposed to supply change as a way of improving security?
Okay. Tony? Yeah.
I think you To get an honest answer, you would have to look through the International Energy Agency's model, and probably, because it is in more detail and easier to get, the model from the Energy Information Agency of the Department of Energy. It shows a significant increase in conservation. It shows alternative fuels coming online. It shows changes in energy efficiency, which are based really on historical trends, which means it's not quite clear you can get there all that easily. But what you're also talking about is an immense, as Michael pointed out, investment in transportation fleets, which in a broad sense can take 20 years to change if you can make them more efficient. And so far, electric cars are interesting toys, and hybrids can work within a narrow range. But when you actually look at the manufacturing cost, the charging cost, and the battery cost, and the life cycle cost of hybrids, well, they have some value as passenger cars. They're much more expensive than ordinary passenger cars, and that presents real problems. Can we get somewhere with different battery technology? Well, the models assume that, but even so, populations grow, demand grows. People want more sophisticated fleets. So these energy models do explicitly model demand on a global basis, country by country. And over time, you can, in theory, change this. But let me just say, having helped develop some of these models in the Department of Energy, there's a real limitation. Any forecast that goes 10 to 15 years in the future is an exercise in magic. Nobody has a history of being able to make those kinds of predictions accurately in terms of economics and technology. And if you actually look at the back of the Department of Energy report, there's a regression analysis. And it shows you historically what happens when people try to get too precise about predicting the future.
There's a more technical answer to that as well, is that 90% of the increase in global oil consumption over the next 20 years will come from non-OECD, the developing countries. The developed countries, Europe, US, Japan, essentially demand is going to be declining across the board as technology moves in and as it has to do with age and other things. But in developing countries, much lower per capita incomes, oil consumption is very closely tied to economic growth, much more so than in the developed countries. And second, it's very closely tied to rising per capita incomes. And that's what developing countries are all about. So the whole shift in the rotation and where demand is coming from for oil is shifting towards that part of the world where oil is tightly linked, oil demand growth is tightly linked to economic growth and rising incomes.
I would just add one caution, Michael. When you go to the United States, you occasionally see that we actually import things from Asia. Now, if you're importing things from Asia, and Asia is dependent on importing oil, one of your little problems is your indirect import gets to be measured in more than 1 million barrels a day. And when you're only talking about direct imports of energy as your sole measure, yes, then the U.S. can have a reduction in direct import dependence from 60 to 40% by 2035 in these theoretical models. But until we actually model indirect imports explicitly, the whole idea that Asia is importing oil and never exporting anything outside of Asia is a rather interesting concept of a global energy model.
Yeah, well, just in terms of controlling the demand side, certainly price signal is most important. So can U.S. Let's say accept the very high gasoline tax? Probably politically no, unfortunately. But to make IEA has made a so-called 450 scenario, which halving the CO2 emission by 2050. to make it happen, the carbon price should be $120 per ton of the CO2, which is currently just $10 or less. So this is a really challenging. It's possible to levy these carbon tax, and we will see that dramatic impact to the demand side. Another one is subsidy or price control in the oil-producing country. They have to phase out. Then the demand will much more be streamlined or suppressed. So how to send the clear signal to the demand side is a way. And for that, let's say Russia is the same thing. If Russian gas consumption is levied by the certain prices and the level of efficiency is coming to the OECD level, then the Russian potential exportation of gas could be doubled, even now. So this kind of, let's say, demand side management, demand side restriction is certainly one very important key issue for the energy, let's say, management or energy policy in the future.
Questions? Right here. The microphone. Right here.
Clement Henry, American University in Cairo. On the supply side, the implications for Asian supply of that one relatively unexplored but increasingly accessible region. Heaven help us with global warming, but I'm referring to the Arctic. Any comments from any of the panelists on that subject?
You have people who, in the energy business, everything is possible, and somebody will charge you for it. But in reality, if we're going to actually see any meaningful structure there beyond what we already know about in Canada, Russia, the United States, it is beyond the bubble point in terms of our ability to predict it. Again, if you ask what can happen in 20 years, the answer is almost anything. But you have to take the answer with, shall we say, several grains of salt. And the Arctic and Antarctica are not going to solve our energy problems, even compared to deep offshore oil off the coast of Brazil. We have, and even sugar cane may offer us more of an option in our lifetimes than Arctic oil.
What did you want to address that?
Yeah, well, same thing, like, methane hydrate is very much abundant just nearby the Japan coast. So Japan is very serious of doing the research, but certainly the cost or price of oil should be $200 per barrel or so to make this commercially viable. But it could happen. So to prepare for that kind of situation. So IEA has long been saying that there's abundant resources under the ground, but the risk is above ground. How can we put investments into these resources? So.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind we've got 1.3 trillion barrels of proven oil reserves today, and in all contradiction to the peak oil people, in the last 20 years we produced almost 30 billion barrels of oil a year consumed, and total reserves have actually increased virtually every year for the last 30 years. So we've got, in fact, there's plenty of oil, proven reserves at $100 a barrel. The problem is getting access to those. 80% of the world's oil reserves are controlled by national oil companies. Huge swaths of that are entirely off limits. And other parts of it are, you can access it only under the most onerous terms and the most high-risk kinds of venture where the terms don't match. So the problem is not peak oil. The problem is, somebody I met recently called, it's peak access. You can't get to the reserves that are there, well-known and low cost for the most part, because they're off limits and controlled by national oil companies. and not being developed and invested in at a pace which can meet demand growth. So the world's increases in demand have to increasingly be met by tapping into a very, very narrow share of existing known reserves and resources. It's like drinking through a straw. You know, when you're dying of thirst and you're forced to drink through a straw, it's above ground that's the problem, not below the ground.
Yeah. May I ask one question to Asan, if I can? The question is that in IEA's World Energy Outlook this last year, it's clearly said that U.S. prospect of oil importation will decline dramatically toward 2035 because of one efficiency. Another one is light tight oil, the shale oil is coming. So about 4 to 5 million barrels per day decline from the peak to 2035. Then United States is no longer need to import oil from Middle East. Does this change the geopolitics of U.S. presence in the Middle East or not? Or do you keep on protecting sea lane for Japan or for other countries? Or do we accept the sea lane protection by China?
Well, first, sea lane protection, actually, when you really think of it, we're not protecting the Strait of Malacca.
Mm-hmm.
What you're talking about is, will we remain in the Gulf? And will we remain in the Middle East? And I think the answer is yes. But when I say that, can I say what's going to happen in 20 years? No. I would just be very careful, though, about this idea of import dependence. First, everybody pays the same global price. If there's a cutoff in Gulf oil, American-produced oil rises in price to the world market price. We can't control it. We can't regulate it, barring a political revolution. It isn't a matter of where you get the oil before the crisis that counts. It's what you have to pay to get it after the crisis that really counts. And I think this is one of the issues. The other is, again, we are tied to a global market. The problem that you don't have really updated, the Department of Energy used to do this, it doesn't anymore, is what is the cost to the American economy if something goes wrong in Asia? What is the cost to the American economy? And we already can see with the European case. It isn't a matter of American strategic interests being dependent solely on some kind of strange regional calculation where global economies don't exist. And I absolutely agree with Michael, but quite frankly, I find there's something rather hilarious about Asian countries assuming that the Middle East, which has a great deal of experience in nationalizing oil, isn't going to do whatever it wants with its oil output if it can double the price and the revenue, regardless of who owns the company or the concession. This is a global structure. And the problem with mercantilism is it didn't make all that much sense in the 19th century. And in the 21st, it can be pretty damn stupid.
But I think Tanaka-san's hitting on an important question. We're having a panel on this at my conference in 2 weeks, as a matter of fact, in Washington. And that is that, you know, the U.S. gets 2 million barrels a day from the Gulf, most of that from Saudi Arabia. And the only reason is because the Saudis discount the oil into the U.S. Or sell it into their own refining system in order to maintain their strategic relationship to help sustain that. And I know I'm getting in trouble because you work those issues much harder than I do, but otherwise that oil, by all economics, should be going to Asia, not to the U.S. It makes no market sense for Saudi oil to come to the U.S. today. But it does because of a deliberate discount of pricing to make sure that the Saudis maintain that million, roughly, of the U.S. market. If that goes away, and other dribs and drabs, and as China's growing dependence on Gulf oil continues, I think there's a real strategic long-term question is how long is the U.S. going to want to keep patrolling the sea lanes to make the sea lanes safe for Chinese oil shipments?
Let me go
and
back.
Investments. Now,
we don't
you're
patrol any sea lanes protecting oil in peacetime. We're not doing it.
It's a global market, you know. I mean, I was in it for 20 years. But as a political perception and strategic resourcing
Let me
question, I think there's an open
But Michael,
question
let
there.
me be very specific. I know exactly what went into the current U.S. strategy. Nobody could have cared less about the preferential price of Saudi oil when they gave the Middle East the same strategic priority they did to Asia and talked about reducing the U.S. presence in Europe. It was seen from a much broader framework of structure. It's the one I outlined. You live in a global economy, you deal with global pricing, and you have to be very careful because ultimately, whatever the markets and structures are today, you're still in our projections, that is the U.S. government, you're at 37% dependence on imports in 2035, which is as far as we can project. Yes, that's a lot lower than 60%, as Tanaka-san has pointed out. But it doesn't make you independent. And frankly, for all that's being said by both presidential candidates and a lot of our members of Congress, we've been saying it since the Nixon administration. It was nonsense then, and it's nonsense now.
But don't you think, Anthony, that the American taxpayers are no longer interested in protecting those who are Asian importers, for the oil from Gulf? Because if you don't need it, and your people will allow the government sending Marines people there to protect and bloodshedding for somebody else?
Well, if the American taxpayer has an urgent interest in this, the American taxpayer is the silentest majority we've ever had.
But I think,
since there is absolutely nobody making the argument.
but I think it's part of the problem with the energy independence argument is that it's a global economy.
Yes.
And the oil supplies to Northeast Asia matter to the United States, whether or not they're also coming to the U.S.
True.
Dave, right there.
Michael Hudson, Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. You've touched on this to some extent already, but I wondered if you could, any of you or all of you could be more specific about what might happen in the next 6 to 9 months. So we're not looking at crystal balls 20 years from now, but something Mr. Tanaka, I think, said, well, yeah, maybe there will be an incident, a violent incident of some kind in the Gulf sooner than we think. And I guess my main question is, what is your opinion of the debate about whether the Saudis can really make it up if all of Iranian or maybe even more Gulf oil in general is cut off for even just a shortish period of time? Can the Saudis do it as easily as they say, and do they have the means of transporting it? Is it the right kind of oil, and so forth? And if the violent incident were to spread, as it could, say this involves an attack on Iran, and it ripples over, say, into South Lebanon, Israel, what would that do to the price of oil and to the European economy and even eventually the American economic recovery, such as it is, within 6 to 9 months?
Well, Michael, let's be very careful. The Saudis have never said that they can make up what would happen if you close the Straits. What they have said is, in the current climate of sanctions, they can make up the difference in terms of surplus capacity, which is absolutely different from this. If you had an all-out effort on Iran's part to close the Straits, the problem is it wouldn't be purely military. It would be who's going to put their tankers through the Straits if there are smart minds going into the Straits, out of the Straits, along the tanker channels, and presumably at loading points. It would take you 4 to 6 weeks, potentially, to totally clear this. There are some technical issues of actually getting secure channels. That might be a matter of a couple of weeks. Now, in terms of whether they would do this and why they would do it, understand that if Iran closes the Straits, the chances that it can keep its military production facilities, its nuclear facilities, and its missile facilities, that this will be a conveniently constrained military response limited purely to what Iran does in the Straits is, shall we say, not a terribly probable scenario, and the Iranians damn well know it. And remember, they went through this in 87 and 88. Now, you can't ever say there won't be a totally irrational pattern of escalation. The 20th century is a pretty good demonstration those things can happen. But I think one needs to be very careful about this, and we shouldn't mix apples and oranges.
Just let me chime in on the spare capacity issue for Saudi Arabia. This is one of the reasons that the prices are $120 a barrel today for Brent, which is the more representative price. It's because your spare capacity in the global production system is shrinking. There's a list of accidents and problems in tiny places that keeps adding up. But if you lose, right now, the latest IEA numbers, you have spare capacity in OPEC of about 2.75 million barrels a day. Almost 2 of that's Saudi Arabia. If you lose 1 million, take 1 million out of Iranian exports. Yes, there's capacity to meet that. Saudis can do that. But each time you do that, it's a double-edged sword because the remaining spare capacity gets tighter and tighter. And this is how the market traders and people who are in the markets every day watching that cushion, because this is an accident-prone oil supply system globally. And so as the Saudis raise production to meet that gap, yes, they can do it, but the cushion that's left over gets tighter and tighter, and you're effectively down to 1 million barrels a day of spare capacity in a 90 million barrel a day industrial system. This is basically flat out. And this is the situation you had in 2007, 2008, which got you to $147. So that, it doesn't take a disruption. This is kind of a slow motion supply shock, if you can call it that. That's tightening that cushion, and the tighter that gets, the more the markets have to bid up, because who knows how much will be available if there's another accident, which this is an accident-prone system.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with Michael and Anthony. The level of replacement of the Iranian oil, which could be lost from the market, is just 1 million barrels or some, because China will buy more, India may buy more. So 1 million barrels per day is not a big deal. Saudi can replace that. Of course, as the issue of this spare capacity is getting less and less. For the context, just give you the number. The IEA countries has 1.6 billion barrels of strategic stockpiles owned by the government. 1.6 billion means if you release 2 million barrels per day, you can sustain 24 months. So it's quite big. A stockpile already exists. If it's 4 million barrels per day, it can go 12 months. So 4 million barrels per day loss is the loss which had happened in the second oil crisis, in Iranian Revolution. So that was the largest loss in the history. So in that sense, of course, these numbers cannot be comparable to the closure of Hormuz Strait, because it's 17 million barrels per day. So it cannot replace any oil. Of course, some can be moved to the different directions, so maybe 10, 12 million barrels per day, but this is not manageable level for the long period. That's also true.
Right here.
Dong Wang from Peking University. I have a question for Mr. Michael Herbert, but also it will be all the better if other two distinguished panelists can also jump in. Mr. Herbert, during your remarks, you mentioned that the mercantilist and zero-sum atmosphere exists in a lot of the Asian energy consumption states. fueled by this conception of they have to control the energy oil supply and by extension the supply routes. And you mentioned that these conceptions actually doesn't work. So I'm curious about, can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Why is that such kind of conception really doesn't work? And are you implying that there is a kind of myth about the concept of energy security? And if so, how are we supposed to separate reality from myths? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And the answer is just what Tony talked about. This is a global market of 90 million barrels of oil a day. Over 50 million barrels a day are traded across borders. Just the spot market alone is 7 or 8 million barrels a day, something like that. So this is a very liquid, dynamic market. So if the Chinese turn Sudan into their private filling station, I don't want to be too blunt about this, but let's be straight, then that 500,000 barrels a day goes to China, but it means they're buying 500,000 barrels a day less in West Africa from Angola or Nigeria. So the market simply reallocates. It moves to different places. And second, take the case of Sudan, where China has invested heavily in production in Sudan. Where is it today? There's a war between South and North Sudan, or Sudan and South Sudan, or a virtual war. They're not producing from the oil fields. How much security did owning that equity, physical control of those barrels by China, how much energy security has that gotten them in Sudan? That's the real risk, is places that you own oil or control oil, political disruptions, all kinds of things. So it's a global market. Trying to say, well, we have our supply here that's safe, it's rarely safe. The sea lanes aren't necessarily safe getting it from one place or another. Pipelines can be bombed. So it's largely an illusion. It's about the market. Is there enough oil in the pool to meet global demand? Not about which corner of the pool you're drinking out of. But that's this perception that if we have physical control of some of our supplies, that somehow that's secure. I think when you look at it closely, it doesn't hold up.
Well, let me just say, as an American, I can hardly wait till the first Middle Eastern country nationalizes an Asian oil company. I mean, it's your turn. And good luck with the whole idea that somehow you are going to have any more control over a Middle Eastern producer if they can make more money somewhere else than anybody else has in recent decades. But there is another little problem here that I would consider. The last time I looked, Asian countries tended to be exporters. So you're going to have a secure mercantile source of oil imports, but you're not going to have any export markets because they won't have any energy and therefore their economy has gone to hell. Let me say that this problem of global dependence exists for everybody. And a mercantile attitude, basically, that pretends that this is somehow a national structure, even in Asia. For example, Thailand, which is one of the world's greatest sources of hard drives, let's say it got its oil and other countries in Asia didn't. Who would buy Thailand's hard drives? And that's just one example of the level of interdependence.
I wanted to ask one specific question about South China Sea. We talked a little bit about the sea lanes, but have the estimates of reserves, whether gas or oil, changed over the last 10 years? Is there some sort of perception about the resource there that has fueled the increase in tensions in the last few years?
I'm not aware of it. I think the first point is we really don't know much because, because of all the border disputes, there's been nothing done out there. So, you know, you don't know anything till you drill a well. That's just, you know, you drill 10 for every one you actually hit something, and this is with the best technology in the world. So we just don't know. That's number one. Second, interestingly, the Chinese have very high estimates of what they think is out there. They're about 8 or 10 times what the U.S. thinks is out there. But again, these are very uncertain kinds of numbers. So I don't think anything has changed. I think there's a lot of journalistic hyperbole about this. Oil-rich, you read oil-rich, but we just don't know. There's no change that I know of in estimates. I think what the change is the intensification of the energy security anxiety as prices rise. The higher prices go, the higher the anxiety. And when we hit $147 in 2008, you know, there was outright sheer panic, and we're near that today as we sit at 120. It's a direct correlation in anxiety and fear over supply access in the future and prices. I think that's what's changed, and the perception of energy security rather than any sense of those resources out there.
How do the Chinese make their estimates? What are they basing the estimates on? If they can't get to the source, they can't drill, they can't...
Well, I mean, USGS does these kinds of things based upon, you know, the seabeds and historical because all around the rim of the South China Sea, there have been plenty of discovered oil and gas resources, mostly gas, frankly, but again, not very many that are really huge. The chances are there are pretty significant supplies. But most of this is done by kind of the shape of the sea bottom and where other production is, and at least at this level, because we just haven't gotten experience out there. It's a very shaky notion when you start doing that.
But what have you got against magic, Wilder?
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. It was an excellent discussion.
We will now have a short break. The next session will start in 15